May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts always be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So a bunch of years ago, I received an unexpected phone call. This is like early on in my ministry career, and I had just taken a new job working at Temple, and this colleague of mine had a local church, and he called me up with a proposition. See, I no longer had Sunday morning responsibilities, and so this person was looking for someone to come and preach just one Sunday a month. So it didn't seem like a big deal at the time. I'd have a few extra bucks in my pocket as well, and so I agreed to the new preaching gig. So I came to learn right away that this colleague of mine was a bit prone to overthinking things. So on the first day, he wanted me to have my very own office space, even though I was only dropping in one Sunday a month, and it seemed like a bit of overkill to me. Still, he showed me to this small office across the hall from his office that was sometimes also the youth minister's office. You could get ready here and keep your stuff in here, he said, and he gave me a key, and so I did. That was my space for the next 6 years, as I would drop in one Sunday a month to give him a break from preaching. 6 years later, I moved on from that campus ministry job, and I took a congregation of my own, and I no longer had those Sunday mornings free, and so I had to stop preaching at this particular church. And at the same time, my life was changing. Brenda and I had started dating, and we wanted to get married. So this church seemed like a natural spot to do that, and the priest was the one who did it for us back in 2010. A few years later, in 2015, some social work colleagues and I were thinking about starting a private counseling practice together. Where would we find office space? So I tentatively reached out to that priest colleague of mine to ask if his congregation maybe wanted to rent us some space. And he was more than amenable because it added some extra income. So as we arrived at the church to survey spaces, the first space that we looked at was that office that he had shown me back in 2004. We could rent that space, and it turned out that the price was right as well, and the vestry was amenable. So it was a good situation all around, and I found myself back in that office. I'm still in that space today, in 2024. Colleagues and I have had thousands of therapy sessions in that former youth minister's room, which we converted into a counseling office. We're coming up on our third rector now that we've been there. And with all that history, when I think of that church, it's St. Albans Episcopal Church in Newtown Square, it has a special place in my heart. I never would have imagined that I'd still be there some 20 years later after just an initial preaching invitation. And the relationship has changed and evolved. I'm not really in any way involved in the congregation now, but it's been an extraordinary blessing to me. Just the smallest opportunity, the gift of having, at the time, a preaching gig, turned into something that was completely unexpected. I didn't know the gift that I was being given when I was first offered those Sunday preaching opportunities. Have you ever had something completely unexpected come to you and turn into something so much bigger than you had initially realized? Maybe something that you didn't even know that you needed. So I want you to hold on to that thought, because it's a major part of the message of this Sunday's gospel. Now, before I get to that message, though, I do take some issue with the choice of how our gospel reading is carved up this Sunday. You may have noticed that the lectionary authors deleted some 19 verses in the middle of this gospel passage. And so the resultant, like Frankenstein version of the gospel that we just heard makes me feel like the disciples are managing a Taylor Swift concert. Because the storyline is all about crowds swamping Jesus and his disciples time and time again. Think of what we heard. Jesus invites his disciples to come and rest after they've gathered this huge horde of followers with their teaching. And they try to get away to a deserted place, but the crowds follow them. And instead of resting as promised, Jesus continues to interact with that pursuing crowd because, as he says, they're a sheep without a shepherd. And furthermore, the next part of this Frankenstein gospel, the section that comes after the deleted 19 verses, in that section, the group again finds himself landing by boat in Gennesaret. And here too, they encounter massive crowds and people begging for healing. So it feels like this whole reading is just about crowd control, and that makes me wonder about the point. Crowds, more crowds, and never a break. That's what it feels like if you cut those 19 verses out. So what did happen in the middle? What happened after the disciples first left by boat and then met the crowds, but before they went to that second beach at Gennesaret, where they were again mobbed? Well, it turns out an awful lot happened. First, there was a miraculous feeding. That first unexpected crowd needed something to eat, and so Jesus instructed his disciples to gather together the loaves and fish that they were carrying. And with just a few provisions, somehow there was enough to feed a massive crowd. And then we do hear that Jesus himself traveled off to a deserted place to pray. Jesus and the group do eventually get some space from that deserted crowd. But turns out that there's even more that happens in those omitted verses. After Jesus prays, he finds his disciples struggling against a storm on a sea, and he walks towards them on water, as one does. And so Jesus, again, calms the storm for those disciples, saving their lives. And then, only then, do the disciples land their boat at Gennesaret, the second location that they encounter the crowds. So that seems like an awful lot to leave out of the gospel reading this Sunday. So if I'm going to choose to ignore the way this passage is, in my opinion, incorrectly carved up and reassembled, and if I have to look at the overall structure of what happens between verses 24 and 54 of this 6th chapter of Mark, I'm going to read them as a whole instead. What is the overarching theme of this gospel section? So one obvious reality is that the disciples teach, and that teaching, it inspires massive crowds. And that's a statement about the power of Jesus' teaching that's proclaimed by his followers. Even his followers are overwhelmed by it, enough to want to get away and to rest. And despite leaving by boat, the crowds follow them, and Jesus has to make a choice. We're told that Jesus sees those crowds as a sheep without a shepherd, and that God in human form will not turn away those in need. He has compassion, and the well-deserved rest will have to wait. But there's a deeper reality as well. Throughout this passage, just like that last example, God abundantly and persistently provides. This story isn't just about God providing for spiritual needs. The crowd has real human needs like hunger. And so in another miracle, just the smallest bit of abundance, a few loaves and fish that the disciples have been carrying is transformed into something so much bigger. God's abundance is as real and as tangible as the next meal in a culture where every meal was hard to come by. God is providing in the most basic of ways with food to fill hungry bellies. And if the disciples somehow missed the point about how God provides in need, that point is made more than evident as they struggle against wars and possible death on the sea at the hands of a storm. Walking towards them on water, Jesus shows how God in human form will not be constrained by the old laws of nature, the things that we think we know about the world. And it's further evidence that something new is occurring between God and humanity. That newness, it defies all previous understandings. It's as surreal as someone walking on water. And the newness is as real as a God who provides by filling bellies and saving God's followers from the sea. And if to underscore the importance of that message of God's persistent provision, the disciples are again met with crowds at Gennesaret. There are still more people in need of God's care. So do you see that arc now? God provides time and again. The disciples learn that they can count upon God's persistent abundance and presence in times of need. And those are gifts that they didn't know existed. From a God whose power transforms God whose power transcends even nature. And God even seems to provide before God's own followers know what they need themselves. Does that shepherd still look at each one of us, anticipating what we need before we need it? Now, sometimes the twists and turns of life can feel like they have no meaning. The wants and desires that we feel like we have aren't always met in the ways that we think they should be. It reminds me of that old Garth Brooks song, I thank God for unanswered prayers. Sometimes a God who seems absent and doesn't give us what we feel like we need most is in fact most present in those moments. The unexpected gifts and the unanswered prayers of life are sometimes the truest signs of God's walk with us because they point to possibilities that we never may have imagined. And so the promise of today's gospel is that God does, in fact, know what we need, perhaps before we even do ourselves. That doesn't mean that we're going to get everything that we want. It doesn't mean that we will avoid hurt or heartache along those journeys. But it does mean that we have a God who is with us in life's transitions, providing exactly the sustenance we need in the moment. So where in your life have you been given exactly the sustenance you needed, even if it didn't appear that way at the time? So I look back in my own life, and there are so many situations where where something unexpected has turned out way better than I ever could have imagined. That call from the colleague in Newtown Square was just one example of a journey that no author could write. And I suspect it's the same for each of you. And if that's the case, how might you celebrate God's presence on the journey? How might you celebrate and step into the God that knows what we need before even we know it? That may seem impossible by human standards, to trust in the unknown. But as we see in today's gospel, our God is a God of the impossible. Our God is a God who creates abundance out of scarcity and calms the storms of the sea. So this Sunday, may God's gifts and even unanswered prayers bolster your faith. And may that faith inspire you to share the good news with others. God is in our midst.